Hi everyone, my name is Eleanor Noyce and I'm the junior staff writer at Diva magazine. Welcome to this conversation for Lesbian Visibility Week. Today I am with Eleanor Medhurst and we are going to be talking all things lesbian fashion history. Eleanor, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, hi, I'm also Eleanor. Eleanor Medhurst. I am a lesbian fashion historian and I run an online blog all about the subject called dressingdykes.com, as well as I post content about it on TikTok and Twitter. And no, not Twitter, Instagram, all of the social media.
All the socials. Fantastic. And so yeah, you founded Dressing Dykes after finishing your MA at the University of Brighton. Could you outline a little bit about what Dressing Dykes is and what it seeks to do?
Yeah, so at my during my degree, I did a undergraduate degree in fashion history and a master's in history of design and material culture. And in both of those, I was looking at like queer fashion history, subcultural fashion. And during my master's, looking at lesbian fashion, particularly people like Anne Lister, who's the inspiration for the TV show Gentleman Jack, was a really big source of research and inspiration for me. But while I was doing all of this, I sort of realized that it was really hard to find sources about lesbian fashion history specifically. Things about lesbian clothing would crop up here and there, but not very often and not in depth. And as a fashion historian, I thought that that really wasn't right at all. Like this was this area that lesbians were completely missing from, when we've got such a rich fashion history. There's so many different forms of style and self-expression that lesbians and other women-loving women or sapphics have worn and used to express themselves or to reach others in community. And it's really hard actually finding a sort of history of those experiences and those kinds of clothing. So yeah, I started Dressing Dykes because I had been doing this research and I wanted to continue. I wanted to share it online. I wanted it to be accessible. And also, when I finished my master's, we were in the middle of the pandemic. So I really didn't have much else to do, but I'm very, very glad that I did. It's been a really big force of sort of lesbian visibility, which is so important today and this week.
Amazing. And building on this, how did you carve your niche? So you've often described lesbian fashion history as being like a one-woman field, you being the one woman. So were you seeking to document these untold, underrepresented stories?
Yeah, so obviously there are some people who have written about various aspects of lesbian fashion in history, including Laura Doan is an example. She's written about some parts of lesbian fashion history, particularly in the 20s. Uh, so many other people have done bits and pieces here and there, but it's never been like a focus for anyone. And yeah, so because I was just focusing entirely on lesbian fashion, it is sort of just me, but it's made other people, I think, realize that, oh, this is a topic that's so important. It's a way that lesbians have expressed themselves and have been visible or perhaps invisible. So the way that I've carved my niche is by basically just doing something that wasn't being done, that is important, and that people have gone, oh my god, yes, I want to know about that.
Absolutely. And clothing and physical expression can be really sort of important for presentation and representation, and particularly amongst LGBTQI people. So in your view, what importance does clothing have, particularly for lesbians, and how does it kind of intersect with identity?
So something that I always say is that clothes can be sort of our inner self on display. Our clothes are sort of the barrier between ourselves and our like personal bodies and the world around us. So they can either be a way that we're sort of expressing ourselves and putting ourselves out there, or a way that we're actively hiding ourselves if we're in a situation that, for instance, isn't safe, might be homophobic. So clothes can say, so they can say and do so many things, but particularly within lesbian history, within communities, they've been a way not to just say, oh, I'm wearing this particular thing which hints that I might be a lesbian, but it's saying, particularly in like butch and femme communities. Oh, this is who I am, and this is the kind of people that I want to associate that with, that I want to attract. Or yeah, it's just that it's about community, and it's almost a language that people learn to speak and learn the nuances of as they sort of get involved within it. But it can also be so much more, because some lesbians are just wearing clothes that they like, and maybe they're not thinking, what does this specific garment mean, what does this pinky ring mean? But it can just be so much, it can be so much more, especially in times when lesbians haven't been visible. When we look at the past, we can make ourselves visible by understanding what clothes might have meant in particular contexts.
Absolutely. And you research a lot about colour theory and the importance of colours like purple and sort of lavender in lesbian fashion. Could you outline a little bit about these colours and how they've been used and what meaning they hold, particularly for lesbians?
Yeah, I love purple as a symbol of like lesbian identity, because it has just been used repeatedly again and again. With like lavender, we've got the Lavender Menace, who were a lesbian activist group. They infiltrated a feminist conference in 1970 wearing t-shirts saying Lavender Menace, which happened after the famous feminist Betty Friedan called lesbians a lavender menace in the women's movement, because the word lavender and the colour or the flower lavender had this association with queerness. So lavender pops up a lot in terms of general sort of LGBTQ culture rather than just lesbians. But then this sort of thread of purple comes through again in violet, and in violets as a flower specifically, which started in the poetry of Sappho, who's almost the original lesbian. There's obviously all these debates about like what Sappho's identity might have actually been or whatever, but at the end of the day, the word lesbian comes from Sappho living on the island of Lesbos. And she would write about girls wearing violet tiaras or crowns of violets in her poems. And then that was picked up again in the 1920s. In Paris at the time, in the 20s and in the early 20th century, there was such a large community of lesbians that it got the nickname Paris Lesbos. And those lesbians often were really, really enamored with Sappho and with Sappho's poetry. So violets came up again. And violets were being occasionally worn on lapels. There was poetry being written in the 20s in Paris Lesbos that would use the theme of violets again. So it's just this like repeated usage of violet and of lavender and of all these other purple things that has just cropped up repeatedly in lesbian history. And then I mentioned violets on the lapels and the Lavender Menace t-shirts, also in lesbian fashion.
Absolutely. And kind of taking a step back, so you've spoken about your interest in lesbian fashion history being piqued by Anne Lister and the subject of Gentleman Jack, of course. Having written a series on Anne Lister's closet on Dressing Dykes, what are some of Anne Lister's typical fashion statements, and what might these say about her personality and wealth?
Yeah, so Anne Lister, in the show Gentleman Jack, we think of Anne Lister as always wearing like a top hat or waistcoats and stuff like that, and that's perhaps a little bit more modern day masculine than the clothes that the real Anne Lister would have actually worn. But that's okay. I always say that that's fine, because it's the way that we now understand her. But the things that she wore in her own lifetime, which was the first half of the 19th century, she was still wearing clothes that did shock people. And in her diaries, she writes about these, particularly her earlier diaries when she was younger. She was a bit more sort of concerned about the things that she was wearing and would write about them in her diaries in sort of a worried way a lot of the time. So sometimes, at one time, she wrote about that she wore a pair of gentleman's braces that she picked up, I think when she was still a teenager or in her early 20s, and that she would try them on or sometimes wear them under her clothes. There's other times where she wrote about not wearing a top hat, but some kind of hat that was unusual and that an acquaintance who knew her would have been struck one way or another by the sight of it. So she was always testing these boundaries with the clothes that she wore, but she wasn't always super confident in it. It was always a point of concern because it was like she really was sticking out in a world that didn't accept her, but she carried on anyway, which I think is amazing.
Definitely. And she's had such a lasting impact because we now have a lot of Gentleman Jack fans kind of taking to TikTok to kind of dress up as her and sort of wear the top hat and imitate the walk, which I think is really amazing that her legacy is kind of being continued through Gentleman Jack and Saran Jones's fantastic portrayal of her. So how would you say that sort of LGBTQI fashion history, sort of particularly lesbian fashion history, informs contemporary style? Like, how would you say that those two interact?
Well, it's interesting because the thing with lesbian fashion history is, unlike a more typical mainstream fashion history, because people have had to hide so much, communities have had to hide so much, trends didn't evolve in the sort of linear way that they might evolve in more mainstream fashion. So sometimes there are lesbian fashion trends, perhaps we could call them, that happened in the past that didn't sort of evolve into anything else and didn't get picked up again because those communities were so hidden. But now when we look at them, and now when we talk about them online, perhaps like in my own social media, in my TikTok videos, sometimes I'll talk about things like the monocle, which was a lesbian signal in 20s and 30s Europe, particularly in upper class lesbian circles. And that's something that sort of completely slid away. But now people online are going, wow, that's so amazing, I want to do that again. And the same with things like pinky rings, which were a similar sort of signal. So there are times, I think, when lesbian fashion garments, lesbian fashion trends get picked back up because someone has realized that they happened in the past and they want to re-celebrate those and make them visible again. And there are other times when maybe they have just persevered through the years. Things like Doc Martens have been a lesbian like fashion staple for ages, particularly from the 70s and 80s. And those have persevered even though they have become more mainstream. So there's a mixture of things that have persevered through the years and have been brought back up, like with things like Anne Lister and her top hats, like in Gentleman Jack, because people want to feel like they've got a history and that they have that they can bring that history into the present and also into the future.
Definitely. And I think TikTok is particularly interesting because we now have a lot of styles typically worn with the kind of Y2K fashion trend. A lot of styles typically worn by queer women in the early sort of 2000 and late 90s, making a bit of a comeback with like the white vest tops and the face frames. Like, I've actually got a face frame. So fashion does draw on pieces typically worn by lesbians who are everywhere in fashion history, and I think is amazing. So what are your favorite fashion moments in lesbian history?
Oh, it's so difficult, especially like I said, because things haven't been like linear, that moments will just crop up here and there and there's such a wealth of them. One of my favorites that I've already mentioned is the monocle, just because I think it's really, really camp and I'm so tempted to just buy myself one and wear it, but I don't even know how I would. I love all kinds of sort of signals, even though the be and end all of lesbian fashion isn't these little signals that people had. A lot of people wouldn't have known a symbol that someone else was using, but I just find them so fascinating. Things like a violet pin to a lapel, which I also mentioned earlier, are amazing. But also, I was talking to my wife just before we started talking, and she mentioned Katie Lang for the cover of, was it Vanity Fair?
Yes.
In that sort of like white vest aesthetic, that late 90s lesbian chic aesthetic. And that was such a pivotal moment for lesbian culture and lesbian fashion, even though it was perhaps only one specific image of lesbianism and lesbian fashion. It was still, and it remains to this day, like this icon of visibility and yeah, I think that it's really great and people are rediscovering it now.
Definitely. And it's interesting.
I'm sorry.
It's interesting that you mentioned Katie Lang as well, because that's such like an amazing, the Vanity Fair with what's it, Jodie Foster,
Cindy Crawford.
Cindy Crawford. Yeah, it was Cindy Crawford. That just testing my knowledge there. So kind of in wider pop culture, we've had cult TV shows like The L Word has been hailed for its fashion moments, particularly Shane's. So what significance do you think that this visibility of lesbian fashion demonstrates? So Shane is a character that's been hailed as kind of universally fashionable, like a fashion icon, when lesbians have been written off almost as the opposite.
Yeah, I actually think that it's funny with characters like Shane and the L Word or other lesbians in media is that they do create this kind of lesbian visibility and visibility of lesbian style. Also almost rare that get the diversity of lesbian style in media. So although we do have characters like Shane from the L Word, I'm coming up blank right now, but there's so many more recent examples as well. It's less common that you see an example of a butch woman who isn't perhaps quite so, I don't know how to describe Shane's style, but a more traditionally butch lesbian you don't see quite so often in media. If I try and think of one, I just think of characters from like Orange is the New Black, which perhaps isn't the best example of like all lesbians everywhere. I think that it is really important to see these characters anytime there's a lesbian character with a specific lesbian style. It's obviously going to be really exciting, but we just want more. Basically, we just want more and to see more kinds of style, more kinds of lesbians, more kinds of queer people in general.
Definitely. And in terms of just to kind of go back to the TikTok side of things, how do you use, because you use your TikTok to kind of disseminate information and content and things like that, how do you use that to interact with people?
How do I use it to interact with people? Well, you get people talking in comments on TikToks, but TikTok's difficult because the comments you have a really small character limit, so it's really hard to actually interact with people from then. I think that with TikTok, you sort of want to just, I try not to get into arguments on TikTok or to go, this isn't the place to have this conversation, because I don't think it's helpful to anyone to ever have like these very short form discussions about topics that are so detailed. So I don't know, I always try to direct people to other social medias that I have or the blog itself where I am able to talk about things in more depth, because TikTok's a really great way to introduce people to a concept. I think when it comes to something that's educational, TikTok is great in that now they do longer videos, but most videos are still only around a minute. You can introduce someone to a concept or a historical figure or a historical community or something, but you can't tell them every single detail. So I do try and make people go and read this article I've written on it or something like that, because that's the only way that you get to know more of the story. Yeah.
Definitely. I think it's really interesting because the curriculum, the school curriculum just currently doesn't really educate people at all on LGBTQI issues, let alone, I'm sure academia in your circles doesn't really equip students with the faculties to understand these histories. So I think it's really important work that you're doing in kind of creating these sort of snippets of information to share.
Yeah, I think it's really important to do work that is accessible, because you don't have to necessarily be doing a degree in it. You don't have to go to a library and hunt down a book. You don't have to have academic institutional access to academic journals, which is where most of the research that I do, if I'm doing, if I'm reading other people's articles, they're on like JSTOR, they're academic journal articles. that so many people do not have access to. So I think that it's really important to just let people know their history, to let people know that lesbian fashion history exists. And that's what TikTok's great for, because people will just be scrolling and then maybe they learn something new.
Definitely. I mean, I've learned a lot from your content personally, and I think it's interesting as well because that lesbian, so it's probably more helpful to talk of lesbian fashion histories, kind of plural, because there's so many kind of dotted across the world, dotted across societies, countries, cultures. And I know that you've done some research into sort of Japanese lesbian fashion history. Is that right?
Yeah, I have. That's honestly some of my favorite research that I've ever done. It's just it's so much harder looking at history in parts of the world that aren't perhaps Europe and North America, because other people haven't recorded them, or if they are recorded, they're in a place, they're within like something that's, it's about something else, and then there'll be maybe a quote about a lesbian wearing something, or someone who might have been a lesbian dressing in a particular way. But it's harder to hunt that down when you don't have the same cultural knowledge. So I think that those histories are so important, and I really do try my best to make them visible and to research them and find out about them. But it's a lot harder. They're a lot more hidden. But the lesbian fashion history in Japan that I've particularly looked at is in the early 20th century in Tokyo. There was a feminist publication magazine called Sato, and some of the writers for that magazine had relationships with each other. They were all women, and some of them had relationships with each other, and some of them dressed in very particular ways that have been recorded. And I think that that's just really fascinating.
Definitely. I mean, because we hear about the histories of you know, so many with sort of Japanese kabuki, and it is super interesting, but obviously we don't necessarily hear so much about lesbian fashion history. So I think that that's really interesting, important work. So in your view, what does the future of lesbian fashion look like, and kind of what do you see as being, you know, the next steps?
Oh, well, I just want people to feel like they have the freedom to express themselves in however they might want to. But on a purely sort of personal level, I also want to see some lesbian fashion trends or style staples perhaps from the past being re-embraced, just because I think it's such a fascinating thing to do, and it's such a great way to honor a history that's previously been purposefully sort of kicked under the rug. So I love when people see maybe a video that I've done on lesbians in the past wearing pinky rings, and they'll say, oh, I'm going to start wearing a pinky ring. I think that it's just such a great way to remember this lesbian history.
Definitely. And I think it's interesting as well because lesbian history, as we, you know, lesbian fashion history, as we've spoken about, is everywhere. Like you can see it in the clothes that Harry Styles wears, you can see it in pieces that drag queens wear, and it's fantastic. So how do you see, do you have any kind of poignant examples of where typically lesbian pieces have kind of popped up in pop culture, maybe with you know, famous figures like Harry Styles? You know, how do you perceive that?
Oh, God, I don't know who in particular to think about, but there was that article recently that everyone was talking about that was like dressing like a lesbian is the powerful new trend, and it was just various women wearing suits. And the thing is, that's not necessarily dressing like a lesbian, but also in some ways it kind of is. So there is this, all sort of, well, not all celebrities, but a lot of celebrities are being a bit more gender fluid, should we say, with the clothes that they wear. And I think that in many instances that started in lesbian communities and in other queer communities and gay male communities. So I think there's that, but also I think clothes that are practical and comfortable being worn by women who are still seen as fashionable and being beautiful, but they're wearing these comfortable, practical clothes. I think that that's also something that started in lesbian communities. And I'm just glad that more women especially are feeling like they can wear clothes that they feel comfortable in, and maybe like flat shoes because they're easier to walk in. And I think that, yeah, although that's not the be and end all of lesbian style, it definitely is part of it.
Absolutely. And I think it's really interesting as well, because I know that when we've spoken before, we've kind of touched on how, you know, fashion is kind of evolving and identities are evolving. So now we've kind of got different understandings of how fashion might intersect, you know, with, so bisexual women might be wearing sort of things that have typically been interpreted as like lesbian fashion statements, and, you know, gay men kind of drawing on lesbian fashion statements. So I think it's really interesting how these sort of looks kind of disseminate and how they're kind of evolving along the lines of, well, historically they are lesbian fashion statements and fashion pieces, but perhaps now they might be more kind of seen as universally queer and specific to queer women in particular. So I think that's interesting.
Yeah. Well, I think that in the past as well, there are lots of times where various queer histories have overlapped, but particularly lesbians and bisexual women have often been in community with each other, and as a result have often been wearing similar clothes. And trans histories have always been overlapping with lesbian histories as well, because these, you know, these communities have always existed parallel to each other. They've always been on the margins, and so have always been sort of close to each other. So while there is that merging now, I don't think that that's necessarily just a new thing.
Absolutely, absolutely. And in terms of your own sort of work, what's next for you, and do you have any upcoming projects?
Yeah, so I'm currently starting the process of writing a book on the history of lesbian fashion, or a history of lesbian fashion. That's in, you know, quite early stages at the moment, but I'm also working on various academic articles on lesbian craft, lesbian knitting, solidarity in lesbian fashion. So it's a lot of writing going on, and every now and then I do a talk online or in person. So if anyone would like to come to any upcoming talks, I don't have anything to promote right now, but do follow me, cheeky wink, and you'll see if I have any coming up. So yeah, there's always things yeah, in the future.
Absolutely, super interesting. Well, thank you so much for chatting to me today. Fabulous. We will be sharing so many more events throughout the week, so please do stay tuned, everyone, and I hope you enjoy.